Hello, and welcome to November 4th. I'm Toby Moffett, your host. My co-host, Abigail, is off today, so you'll have just me here. If you've been with us for the past several months, you know that we created this show called November 4th to get people to start to think about the day after the election. And from our point of view, hopefully the day after Donald Trump is defeated. And we wanted them to not just think about how we repair the damage or rebuild America, but how really we reimagine it. And so we've looked at climate change. We've looked at immigration and the need for immigration reform. We've looked at the Department of Justice, which has become the Department of Injustice, and what we do about all that and how we restore integrity in the rule of law. We've looked at education and what COVID has done and what the implications of that might be. And so here we are, not a week away, but less than a week away from November 3rd. And we're coming up on the day after that election when hopefully we'll be able to imagine a new country with new leadership and new ideas. So this episode is very important because of what's going on out there around the country. And that is attempts to suppress the vote in a number of states, probably in almost all states, and certainly in states that have leadership in governors who have more or less blatantly dedicated themselves to suppressing the vote, to preventing people from voting, to creating obstacles to people voting, and to creating doubt about whether the vote will be counted and the vote total will be accurate. And so we now have also, in addition to voter suppression and long lines, we have distrust on all sides of the political spectrum in our political process. And so that's going to be another thing that we're going to have to reimagine as to how we repair it. So today on voter suppression, we really tried to take a look at where we think it's most likely to occur, but also where it's most likely to occur where it could make a big difference in the presidential election. And so we'll have guests from Georgia, we'll have guests from Florida, we'll have guests from Arizona, and a guest from North Carolina, all of whom are on the ground right now fighting against efforts to suppress votes. We're going to start with Porsha White, and Porsha is with Let America Vote, great organization, was formerly the Georgia leader, has Georgia roots, I imagine. And Porsha, it's great to have you here. Before we dive into this, let me also say we'll have Reginald Bolding from Arizona coming up soon. He's a state rep, chairman of the Black Caucus in the Arizona State House, chairman or vice chair, I think, of the Western Black Caucus groups from the various legislatures in states out west, and very centrally involved in trying to confront voter suppression in Arizona. We'll have Desmond Mead. Some of you may have seen him on 60 Minutes not that long ago. He's with a group the Florida Restoration Rights Group that is focused specifically on ex-felons and their right to vote, and what's happened to Amendment 4 that the people passed to give those ex-felons a right to return to their citizenship and their voting. We'll hear from Tomas Lopez from Democracy North Carolina, who also at one point was with the NYU Brennan Center for Justice. And we'll hear from Cindy Battles, who's with the program coordinator, I should say, in Georgia for Common Cause. So we're anxious for all that. Porsha, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me, and good to see so many familiar faces on this call as well.
Well, it's an honor. It's an honor to have you. We were all, I think, our eyes were opened just a short time ago when Stacey Abrams went through that campaign, where shamefully the Secretary of State, the person in charge of elections, was an elected official who was also on his way to becoming governor and is now I assume you'll tell us, actively involved in voter suppression efforts. So you're on the ground in Georgia. I bet you never imagined even a year ago that we'd be here just days away from the election and people would be talking about Georgia as a possible turning point in the whole thing. But what let me ask you this, Porsha, what are your greatest fears? What are your one or two greatest fears about what happens with the result here?
Well, first, let me say I definitely expected Georgia to be on everybody's minds this close to the election day. I know we've been working really hard the last few years, so I fully expected this. But I think that one of my biggest fears is that people are going to look on election night and are going to see what we're calling a red mirage. People who voted on election day, who and the results will potentially be leaning more towards Donald Trump as the winner, and that he will declare himself the winner, and his supporters will go off and think that they have won. And then in the following days, when we're counting votes, we'll start seeing that Joe Biden will take the lead, and then the narrative will become, oh, they cheated, oh, they stole the election, and it will cause so much chaos and just so much discord and distrust in the process. And
are you confident, by the way, that the Georgia vote won't come in on election night?
I don't think I'm confident in much of anything in terms of Georgia's election results that night. I think nationally we will see, of course, we'll definitely have a bunch of results that night. But I think that, again, nationally, it'll just create a red mirage. And then once things start coming in, as they start counting all of these early votes and these mail-in ballots from all across the country, from all across the world at this point, because we've got a lot of military people who are voting, and heck, at this point, people voting from outer space, right? We'll start to see a little bit of a better picture and a clearer picture, but a different picture than we might see on election night.
Okay. What's happened in Georgia over the past, year or two or three in terms of polling places? Have polling places been closed?
So
reduced?
I definitely want to leave some of this for our specific Georgia person, but what we have seen is that there has been some uncertainty in where some of the polling places are. In general, things move. People are not properly notified. There's been today, we are experiencing the aftermath of Hurricane Zeta, and that hit us this morning. And so we are seeing power outages across much of Georgia, where there are now polling places who can't open because there is no power. And so there's definitely been a lot of uncertainty, not just today, but over the past few years that have caused, again, some confusion, and a lot of that is manufactured confusion, right?
Yeah, I didn't mean to suggest that your purview was only Georgia. I know you have the Georgia roots, but even more broadly, isn't it the case that a lot of polling places have been closed, and particularly for people of color?
Absolutely. We're seeing it even recently in Texas, where suddenly there can only be one drop box per county. And whereas people thought that they had multiple options, especially in these huge counties of millions and millions of people, now they have to drive hours in some cases to get to one drop off box in the county, so that they don't have to stand in these inevitably long lines on election day. We've definitely seen polling closures over the past few years, especially with the rolling back of the Voting Rights Act. And states have felt more and more emboldened over the past few years to make changes that will limit people's access to the ballot.
I mean, we all know that, unfortunately, voter suppression has been a very American thing. It's not a recent phenomenon.
Definitely not.
But it was relatively recently that we had Republican presidential candidates such as McCain, Romney, and George W., who didn't seem to pin their whole strategy around shutting people off from the democracy. I'm not saying that they were the kings of inclusion, but they that's in stark contrast to what we're seeing from this president and his people, don't you think?
Absolutely. I don't think that, at least in recent memory, I can recall any president sitting in the highest office in the nation calling for such blatant voter suppression, doubting every step of our democracy, of our voting process, calling into question so many things happening across the country, and just systematically dismantling people's trust in what should be the most sacred right that we have, and the fundamental basis of our democracy. So it's been very scary to watch. I think every time I get an alert that he has tweeted something and it is normally about voting, that my heart kind of stops, because I know that we're about to have another headache, trying to make sure that people trust the process, that they know what's really going on and not just listening to conspiracy theories and outright lies.
Porsha, don't go away. We're going to have you joined by Reginald Bolding, who I mentioned briefly prior. He's with the Arizona state legislature. He is a state legislator, and he's with the group called Arizona Coalition for Change. Reginald, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I read a lot about you, and I know that, I'm always interested. Maybe I'm a lot older than you, but I've tried to straddle in my life, a political life, being an office holder, which I was as a member of Congress some years ago, but then also trying to, be a responsible citizen and an active citizen. And I look at your background, and there it is. I mean, you're deeply involved in the Arizona legislature. You're using the machinery of the democracy as you see fit and to your fullest extent. And at the same time, you got one foot on the outside with people who are pressing and lobbying. Tell us what's going on in Arizona. We're very anxious to hear, because as with Georgia and Florida and North Carolina, the other states we're hearing from here, any one of those states could be the difference.
Yeah, Arizona is a place right now where we're really we're fired up. Over 1 million ballot returns have already been counted. What we saw in 2018 literally motivated our community. So we saw 4 statewide pickups. We saw the first United States woman, a Democrat, elected to statewide office. We've seen the closest state legislature since 1966. And that set a proof of concept that if we turn out and vote, we win. And right now, while we know Arizona is a battleground state, that truly has been built ever since, SB 1070, the Show Me Your Papers law happened back in 2010. And there's been a steady growth of registration, turnout, and focus on really changing the electorate.
What does suppression look like in Arizona?
So we've had several attempts at voter suppression from a legislative end all the way to an executive end. So what we've seen is attempts to kick people off of what we call the PEBBLE, or permanent early voting list. And basically what this says is if you want to have an absentee ballot, you sign up on this list one time and you will always receive your ballot via mail. We've seen legislative efforts to remove people from that. We were able to defeat that. We've seen efforts to not allow college students to use their dorm addresses for registration, even if they're living there the most part of the year, to using their home address. That's the only address that they'd be allowed to use. We were able to defeat that as well. But now our Attorney General has something called the Elections Integrity Unit, which is designed to ensure that there is integrity at the polls and integrity within our elections, which just could be used for a number of issues that we're keeping our eye out on.
I think the president created some nice sounding commission about election integrity to investigate the massive fraud that he continues to say is out there, and they closed up shop and decided there wasn't fraud, as I recall.
Yeah, we know that there's no claims that have been substantiated with regards to fraud. We know that what the president is doing is he's trying to build a case in order to make the results questionable. And here in Arizona, we passed a law a year ago to allow our county recorders to begin counting ballots 2 weeks before Election Day. So on Election Day, we feel pretty confident that we'll have a good idea of what the results are here in Arizona. I mean, it's here in Arizona, over 80% of people vote by mail, and they've been doing that for almost 30 years. So this idea that we should no longer trust the mail system is a little laughable, especially when I hear some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, when in fact, they were elected by mail-in ballots and so many others for the last, 30 years. So, yeah.
Yep. So for those who are keeping score out there, a lot of people out there, and this will be live streamed on YouTube, and a lot of people will see the show live. A lot of people see it afterwards, but people are, people who are just really interested and focused on next week are trying to figure out now which states do I have to worry about not being decided on the day of November 3rd. Are you saying that Arizona more likely than not will know the results?
So we'll know at least 80% of the results by Election Day. One thing that we're going to try to do, so our cutoff for people to put their ballot in the mail has just hit. So what we were asking people to do was send their ballot in the mail by October 27th, just to ensure it's in on time. So we're expecting that people will show up to the polls, but what we know is unless there is an extremely close race, and we're talking, tens of thousands of votes, thousands of votes, then it will be uncertain. But if we see a substantial margin, if we're talking, 3 to 7 points, you can be pretty confident that those thoughts will carry on.
And you've got not just the presidential, but a big Senate race with Kelly versus McSally. McSally being the incumbent who was appointed after being defeated in another Senate race, as I recall. And then you've got, a couple of House congressional races that might be close, or no?
Yeah, so we like to call Senator McSally our unelected senator, and then our elected senator, which happens to be Kyrsten Sinema. So our unelected senator, McSally, she's in for a battle. We know Captain Mark Kelly, he's run an amazing campaign, and we fully expect him to win that race. And what we have seen within the GOP with regards to Congressman David Schweiker is that he's under several investigations, and that has clouded many people in his district to question whether or not they can trust him. So we have a congressional district in CD6 with Dr. Hiro T. Bernini, who we think has an excellent opportunity to be elected.
How would you characterize your constituents? Are they dispirited or depressed, or how are they feeling about this, or just plain worried?
I think there is a mixture of fatigue, optimism, uncertainty, and excitement, all boiled up. It really depends on what side of the bed you wake up, because what we know is that we've seen this story before, in which going into Election Day, you feel like we know what the results are, we know what the outcome is, only to be stunned. And in Arizona in 2016, it was extremely bittersweet, in which we were able to get rid of one of the most notorious sheriffs in Joe Arpaio and remove him from office. But at the same time, we saw President Trump elected, which was just so that that continuum of uncertainty is on high alert here, and we don't want to let our foot off the pedal until Election Day, until 7 p.m. that day.
Great. Stay with us. We're going to go now to Tomas Lopez of Democracy North Carolina. I mentioned him before. He's coming to the stage right now. Tomas, thanks for being with us.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I have a soft spot in my heart for North Carolina because I'm a Yankee boy. I'm from Connecticut. but I married a girl from Lexington, North Carolina, in the Piedmont, just south of Winston-Salem. And I spent time campaigning for others in North Carolina. And in 2016, I was one of several people who was full-time in the last several weeks helping to run two counties, one Forsyth, where Winston-Salem, Wake Forest is, and then the county where my wife is from below that in Lexington. So, and I'm also very deeply involved in the Cal Cunningham campaign for Senate as well as a supporter. But thank you for being with us. You have a great record. What are you seeing on the ground there, and what are your biggest concerns right now?
Well, I appreciate your having me on and my being on with a number of really effective and great advocates. I think, we're watching a number of things in North Carolina in terms of voting access, right? We went into the fall aware of certain issues that we knew were going to affect voting in the pandemic context, right? One was a sharp increase in people voting by mail. So unlike a state like Arizona, mail voting is not very popular traditionally in North Carolina. Only 4% of ballots cast in the 2016 general election were mail ballots. This year so far, we've already had over 800,000 absentee ballots submitted, 1,400,000 requested. So again, a much larger proportion of people voting by mail and people having to navigate that process. Second thing, we knew that there was going to be a need for increased access to in-person voting to accommodate social distancing. And third, we were generally aware of obviously an intense atmosphere around the election, plenty of first-time voters voting by mail for the first time, confusion over voting rules, things that we see in every high turnout election year, but heightened by everything coming into this year. What we've seen so far are, number one, people are voting in really large numbers, just like they are everywhere else. Two, we are seeing so far that some of the things that have been put in place to make mail voting more accessible, I think, are helping increase the rate of absentee ballots that are accepted. So in our primary, 86% of absentee ballots were accepted. So far, 98% have been accepted in the general election. So it's a pretty sharp increase. Again, we want that number much closer to 100, but that increase is pointing in the right direction. And that's where a lowered witness requirement helps. In litigation, where we've been successful in winning a cure process for people to fix problems with their ballots before they're just thrown out.
I've been saying this for years, and it's not exactly profound, but I think it's important for people to have some focus on. Doesn't it matter who the governor is in terms of the electoral machinery and how much voter suppression there is? I remember in 2016, in your state, we faced huge problems from the governor at the time, who now Governor Cooper defeated. But the governor does control a lot of the machinery, or can, right?
Well, I would actually draw some important distinctions here, right? We've got 50 states and 50 different sets of rules for how elections are run. So in over 30 states, an elected Secretary of State runs elections, and that direct elected official has a lot of control. I think we've seen in some states, we can think of Kansas under Chris Kobach, where an elected official running an election can really, have, I think we see a harmful influence on voter access. In North Carolina, the governor does appoint the majority of members of our state board of elections, but that does operate as an agency independent from both the governor and the General Assembly, which I think is an advantage, right? And we've got our state board of elections, our 100 different county boards of elections, which also provide important points for people to go in and affect decisions at the local level. So as important as the governor and other people that the governor appoints are, so many of the things that are actually important in terms of counting votes, the way rules work, where polling places end up getting placed, a lot of that is a very local process, actually.
As we, the name of this show is November 4th. We created it many, many months ago because we wanted people the day after the election to start to reimagine what a new country looks like in many respects. So one of those respects would be our democracy and access to it, and who controls the machinery of the democracy, and so forth and so on. What's the point of having an elected official himself or herself be in charge of votes and counting votes. Isn't it sort of crazy? Shouldn't we have a, speaking of independent commissions, I mean, shouldn't we have a non-elected appointed committee, even if it's bipartisan, to play the role of the Secretary of State when it comes to election time?
One of the things that you point out that's really important is trying to separate politics from election administration. What we've had, I think in much of the country over the last few decades, and in some ways it's not new, but it's been heightened. I think certainly Florida 2000 was a really important turning point in this in recent history, right? Is a depoliticization of election administration. Now, you can go back to Jim Crow. You can go back to the ways in which election administration has always been tied in many ways to the politics of the moment. But if we can have professional election administration, if you can separate it from politics, that is an advantage, right? That elections, regardless of who is taking part in them, are for everybody, and they need to be run in a way that's for everybody, right? And I do think, there are benefits, even where you have structures like in North Carolina, where it's not one elected official. There are probably even ways in which you can improve on it and sort of insulate that process from some of the day-to-day politics. I mean, in some ways it's consistent with redistricting, right? You think about what happens after this election, you think about 2021, all over the country, we're going to be drawing new maps. And, you talk about, the incentives of the people drawing the maps. That's going to be a really big thing next year.
Absolutely. But stay with us. Don't go away. We're going to bring to the stage now Cindy Battles, who's the program coordinator for Common Cause of Georgia. We've had some Common Cause guests on this show in the past weeks and months, and they've always just contributed so mightily. I might add that one of my former colleagues in Congress many years ago was Bob Edgar, who became head of Common Cause nationally and unfortunately passed away a few years ago. We very much miss Bob. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you. Good to have you.
Great. So what's your biggest fear on the ground there? What you imagine yourself on Wednesday morning or Wednesday night or Thursday morning, looking back, what are you going to be thinking about?
I mean, the number one thing, and I think other people have also covered it, I'm not necessarily convinced that we're going to know the results Wednesday morning or Thursday morning, right? I think we need to think about the fact that people are using vote by mail and absentee ballots in untold numbers for this election, and we need to make sure that we give states time to count those ballots. So I think my number one concern is people's expectations, because we are so used to knowing who's going to be the next president when we go to bed. So that messaging is really important, that we make sure people know that we need to count every vote. I think the other concern that I have is we know that this new system that the Secretary of State has bought, Dominion, has not performed well in the elections that it's been involved in so far. We've seen long lines as a result of the bandwidth and the e-poll books. So I think that we could see the same thing happen on November 3rd. So I think that's probably one of my biggest concerns, is how this is actually going to work. Because we know that there are deliberate attempts to suppress the vote, and then we know that there are situations where the vote is disenfranchised because of lack of resources or bad systems, or even in the state of Georgia, areas that don't have adequate bandwidth to do the things that they need to do with these systems.
Tell us again what percentage of the vote will have been cast by Election Day?
So right now, the way it's looking, at least, I mean, we're at about 47% of registered voters who have already cast their ballot. We've got today and tomorrow for early voting, and we know that absentee ballots are still coming in.
Are there long lines? Long lines?
There have been long lines, yes, especially the first day of early voting, which was in large part because the bandwidth for the e-poll books wasn't where it needed to be. So it was taking twice as long to process every voter. And then we've just seen long lines because in some counties, they have one early voting location. We really needed the HEROES Act and that extra election funding to help staff and give resources to our counties, especially when you look at the economic crisis we're in as a result of COVID-19.
Have you found many instances where people wait for hours in line and then get up there and find out that they've been removed from the rolls, or, they don't have the proper or whatever ID or whatever? Does that happen much?
Oh, absolutely. That's happened, especially when lines are long and they don't know about the My Voter Page website that they can go check to make sure that that they have the right ID, that their voter status is where it needs to be, that kind of thing. So that's one of the things that I would tell your listeners is to go to mvp.ga.gov before they go vote, because one of the things that we're going to see on Tuesday is a lot of people's polling locations have changed. So they're going to stand in line for hours and find out they're at the wrong polling location, and they're going to have to vote provisionally and then go back to their county election office to cure that provisional ballot.
And when things go wrong like that, are there people there that can help them?
Yes. So we have a number of people on the ground. We have recruited about 1,200 nonpartisan poll monitor volunteers. We're going to be in 90 counties. Right now, we've trained about 3/4 of those volunteers. They'll be wearing a shirt that's easily recognizable, and it'll have the hotline, which is 866-OUR-VOTE. Again, that number is 866-OUR-VOTE, so that they can get the help that they need.
Now, is that a coalition that's doing that, or is that Common Cause, or?
It is the Election Protection Coalition is 13 organizations in Georgia that work on voting rights and making sure that everybody gets to cast their ballot.
All civil society, nonprofit.
Exactly. All nonpartisan C3s who just want everyone to be able to cast their ballot the way that we believe everyone has the right to vote should.
Good. I'm going to ask our producer, Olivia, to bring our other guests back because we have some questions, one of which is about COVID. How is COVID impacting in any way that sort of manifests itself so you can actually say this is a COVID impact?
So one of the things that I think it's done is obviously we're seeing a record number of people asking for absentee ballots because they don't feel like it's safe going outside. For whatever reason, the Secretary of State decided to use Runback, a company in Arizona, to process those again. So we saw an issue where people didn't believe that they were getting their absentee ballot because it was taking 3 weeks instead of the 3 to 5 days that it does when the counties process them themselves. So there's been a lot of confusion in that area. The other thing that we're seeing is the number of counties that are just working super diligently to try and process all those absentee ballots. I've talked to a number of county election officials that are, in Jones County, they only have 2 full-time staff. And so they're working, crazy number of hours to try and get those processed. Georgia has allowed that counties are able to scan those absentee ballots. They can't tally them yet. So that's kind of helping the process. But again, this goes back to what we were talking about before, where the HEROES Act funding would have come in really handy because those counties could have hired additional staff to help do this.
Just to make that clear, that's the funding that's been in dispute between Speaker Pelosi and the White House for weeks and weeks. The House in Washington passed funding and has been on record, public record, as being in support of that. And that, I think that's what you're referring to, right?
Exactly.
Right.
It passed the House. It didn't go anywhere in the Senate. And then they tried to negotiate another bill. But Speaker McConnell, he basically tabled that in favor of rushing through SCOTUS justice. Let
me ask Porsha about the COVID. What do you have a multi-state view? What are you seeing?
I think that exactly what was just said was correct. We're seeing a high number of people, of course, who are requesting mail-in ballots, which of course leads to, in some places, just overwhelming number of local election officials who are overwhelmed, right? We're also seeing, of course, some states, this is the first time they've allowed mail-in ballots at this sort of level before without like more limited scope of excuses. And so they are just overwhelmed and underprepared, again, because COVID funding was passed for elections back in May with the HEROES Act, and it has been sitting there, and we were not able to get the $4 billion that everybody agreed that we needed in order to make this process a lot more smoothly.
Right, Tomas. I'm sorry, Tomas. What about the COVID impact in North Carolina? Do you see it?
Absolutely, and we have a significant increase in the use of absentee by mail ballots. Major increase in that this year. We had rules that have been changed because of it. And I think fortunately what we've also seen is this pretty dramatic increase in early voting hours in North Carolina. So more places where people can vote in general, and I think that is a good thing.
How about poll watchers? Is it taking its toll in terms of not enough poll watchers, or are you okay there?
Well, I mean, I think what we are seeing in terms of staffing is that so far we're holding up okay. Just today, actually, there is a situation in a rural county where there is a site that's dealing with a COVID outbreak among some poll workers, and that county is working on filling some gaps there. But thankfully, we're seeing much less of that than we might have feared, certainly going into the fall.
We have Reginald, we have a question that's Arizona specific for you from one of our participants, viewers, and that is, how close are you to taking control by Democrats of the legislature? Can it happen this year? If not, when? And most importantly, if and when it does, what changes would you, as one of the leaders of elections reform activities, what would you be promoting and sponsoring?
Yeah, so to the question, how close? This close, and I'll get specific, right? So there is a 31-29 difference between Republicans and Democrats in the House. So there's 31 Republicans, 29 Democrats. So we're one seat away from a tie, 2 from the majority. And in the Senate, there are 13 Democrats and 17 Republicans. So 2 votes away from a tie, 3 from a majority. And, the likelihood is about 90% likely that we will absolutely take the House. And it's looking extremely likely that the Senate the margins will narrow if it won't flip. And that's important. Just taking control of one chamber allows us to really put a check on the governor, who has had, not only the House and Senate for a number of years. So what we truly believe is that it's going to allow us to, first and foremost, make sure that democracy is a top priority, because we have so many people here in Arizona. If they could have access to participate in democracy, they'd be voting, and we'd ensure that year after year after year, we have people with progressive ideas that are actually going to be elected. So tackling, democracy reforms, making sure that we're standing up for our public education, those are going to be some of the top priorities that we lead into. And we feel extremely confident that on election night, we'll be able to say for the first time since 1966, the House has actually flipped.
Unlike some of the other states we've heard from, it seems like you're farther ahead in mail-in ballots, right? In terms of how that system works and how it's used.
Yeah. So yes. Yep. So
you're not looking for big changes there, right?
So, I mean, the biggest thing that we want to make sure is that we're still providing an opportunity for people to participate in ways like same-day voter registration. We see a lot of places around the country that has same-day voter registration. Arizona has the capability to do that. There's also opportunities for us to look at some of our our campaign finance reforms. We're seeing incredibly large sums of money being spent in our elections. And we want to make sure that we are strengthening democracy in those aspects, giving people an automatic voter registration. We want to give people more opportunities to participate.
And Cindy, in Georgia, what are the one or two top election reform measures that you would promote?
So there are actually two of them that we're working on this coming legislative session. One of those is we want to see voting rights restored for returning citizens. We know that historically speaking, crimes of moral turpitude was added to the Constitution to disenfranchise certain people. So we have been working on legislation that defines moral turpitude and would restore the right to vote to thousands of returning citizens. And then our next step would be taking that even further so that both formerly and currently incarcerated people would be able to exercise their right to vote. The second thing that we're trying to do is pass legislation for vote centers, because we know a lot of polling locations are difficult to get to. We know that they are steadily closing polling locations. So if we had vote centers in counties, then residents of the county could, just like what we do during early voting, right? They could go to any polling location in their county and cast their vote, which is going to be a huge thing when you're getting off work at 5 and you've still got to go, get your kids and fix dinner and that kind of thing. So those are two big pieces of legislation we'd like to see passed in 2021.
Great. We have another question from the audience, which is, it's very much like one of the previous questions, except in this respect. Do you think that in 5 years from now, mail-in voting will be the thing, as opposed to in person?
Yeah, I think it's the thing now. I think that if we get this process right, more and more people are going to be voting absentee. More and more people have used it these days. They see how convenient it is. I think that there are definitely ways we can improve the process, including who we have processing our absentee ballots. But I think that if people trust this process, and remember, it is a process that you can trust, right? This has been around since the Civil War, for crying out loud.
Yeah, apparently even a guy named Donald Trump trusts it when it comes to his own mail-in, or however he does it, right? In Florida. Yeah.
And we want everyone to be just as confident as the president is in casting their vote by mail.
You agree with that, Porsha?
Absolutely. We know that this is safe and secure, and it's been time tested. So I think that this is going to be the new trend.
Great. Well, thank you both, and thank our other guests for joining us. It was really interesting, and we knew that if we could find people who are actually on the ground fighting these battles, fighting against voter suppression, that it would be very, very useful. And judging from the response and the questions, I think that's been the case. As I said at the top of the show, Abigail Omojola is off today. She'll be back, and we hope to see you. The name of this show is November 4th. We didn't anticipate we'd be doing a show on November 4th necessarily many months ago when we came up with this idea for the show, but we're planning one for next Wednesday, the day after Election Day. So we hope you'll join us then. Until then, thanks and take care.